Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Kelsey Goforth, and I'm Dying with Dignity Canada's Program Director. I'm thrilled to welcome you today to the first session of this year's Focused Forum, Reflections on Death and Dying, Creating Space for End-of-Life Conversations. Today's topic is Looking Back, MAID in Canada. Today, I'm speaking to you from the traditional territory of many nations, including the Wendat, Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and the Mississaugas of the Credit located in Toronto and covered by Treaty 13. I acknowledge the legacy of colonialism and the impact it has had on all areas of life for Indigenous peoples, including healthcare. As part of DWDC's adherence to the values of inclusion and people-centeredness, we're committed to working towards recognizing, respecting, and addressing the distinct health needs of Métis, Inuit, First Nations, and Indigenous peoples related to end-of-life and medical assistance in dying. We will continue to work to listen to and amplify the voices of Indigenous communities in the discussions of end-of-life choice. We will be meeting for a second session in this series on Thursday. This is the first, as I mentioned, but we do have more coming up this week and in the months to follow. If you haven't done so already, you can register using the link that's in the chat. The topic will be Looking Back, a History of Attitudes Towards Death and Dying. Before I welcome today's speakers, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. Everyone on today's call is muted. However, we would love to hear your questions and comments, and there will be opportunities to share them. You can do so by typing your question in the question bar on the Zoom panel, and I will read it out for you at the end. Please keep your question as clear and concise as possible. We do have hundreds of you joining us this afternoon, which is great, but we would like to try to get to as many questions as we can. So as much clarity as possible would be appreciated. If your questions are quite personal in nature, I would encourage you to email us at support@dyingwithdignity.ca so we can follow up with you individually that way. Today's session is also being recorded, so you don't have to worry about taking too many notes. You're welcome to watch the session later or share the link with folks who maybe couldn't join us this afternoon. Now, to introduce today's speakers, we have with us today Price Carter. Price is the son of Kay Carter and brother to Lee Carter, who brought the case for the right to an assisted death to the Supreme Court of Canada. Price assisted his sister as the case became more public and remains engaged in seeing that those rights are eventually enshrined in law so that all Canadians might enjoy the beautiful death that his mother Kay had. We also have Dr. Ellen Wiebe with us. Dr. Ellen Wiebe is a clinical professor in the Department of Family Practice at the University of British Columbia. After 30 years of full-service family practice, she now restricts her practice to women's health and assisted death. She is the medical director of Willow Women's Clinic in Vancouver and provides medical and surgical abortions and contraception. She developed Hemlock Aid to provide consultations for doctors and patients about aid in dying and provides assisted death. Next, I'd like to introduce Kimberley King. Audrey Parker drew the country's attention to the impacts of the harmful requirement in the federal assisted dying law. Audrey asked close friend Kim King to continue her advocacy for Audrey's amendment. Following her death, Kimberley worked closely with Dying with Dignity Canada to continue to fight against the late-stage consent requirement. In March 2021, changes to Canada's MAID legislation became law, and Audrey won her fight for all Canadians. So welcome to all three of you. We're so thrilled to have you with us this afternoon and look forward to hearing from you as we move through the session. We're going to start by talking to Price a bit about his experience and his mom, who many of us recognize and have followed her story over the years. So your mother, Kay, initiated the court case Carter versus Canada that eventually led to the decriminalization of MAID. Many of us recognize her photo and we know some of her story, but can you share with us a bit more about who your mother was?
Sure. I'm 65 years old and I have lived long enough to have met quite a few people. She was quite a unique lady in spite of the fact that she was my mother, and I'm biased in that regard. She was, I'm one of 7 children, and this is from a couple that decided they were going to have no kids. But the way they brought us up was, well, we, of course, we thought it was quite normal, but for them, it was quite different from my friends. The dinner table would be a lively debate about something. And if everyone agreed that everyone had the right to smoke or whatever that was, then mom would take the contrary view. And just so we could have a good debate on that particular topic. She was engaged, she was engaging. And from the get-go, from a little fellow, she'd be off to a meeting for perhaps it was the Hemlock Society or other various groups that she sort of championed. She was a champion of the underdog, and just a little bit different. Both my parents, a little bit different from most, but really in very, very good ways. She was really only upon, I guess, reflection do you realize how lucky I was to have. We were lucky to have a woman like that, of parents like that to guide us to become who we are now. Just a correction on the case. Of course, it was mom's death that was the sort of the catalyst for this process, or the test case for this process. But if I could say that mom was the sort of the nuclear energy rods for this particular thing, the engine was Lee, my eldest sister Lee. That woman is a real dynamo, and she took many of the lessons that mom taught us and dad taught us to heart. And it was her BCCLA and her were the ones that brought the case, of course, but she was unstinting in her championing of this particular case. And when she was asked, apparently by my mom, would you, I've decided to go down this particular path. Would you help me with my end of life choice? It was an automatic, yes, we'll do that. So that's sort of what she was generally. When it comes to the actual, the reason that we're here, her particular case, it's interesting. I would sit. I used to be a pilot for almost half a century, and I'd sit beside people for hours and hours and hours, and this would come up in conversation. And it was interesting because whenever I talked to someone about this, because it's a debate or a discussion we don't have very often, it would be that they'd all say, "Oh, she chose to do that. What did she have?" And I'd pause and I'd say, "That's an interesting question because everyone asks, but it's not about what she had. It was about her choice because of her level of comfort with living." And she was when she decided that this her level of comfort wasn't going to be met, and she had a diagnosis that was terminal as far as she was concerned, that she went, I want to go. And then she asked Lee, and then Lee started that whole process, which led, of course, to the BC court process, the BC Supreme Court, Court of Appeals, and eventually the Supreme Court case. But it was, and in terms of the history of this, we knew that she wanted to do this. Of course, when she died, we all had, it's not for this particular discussion, but it was such a lovely process from the very beginning until she died in our arms, that I find myself, I really want to share that with people because it can be like this. We're such a death-denying society, and she was not a death-denying woman, and she instilled that in all of us. So when she decided to go, there's 7 kids, and I would hope that you have 7 different minds, and we certainly did. And there were some that were not, I don't know if they weren't for it, but they didn't agree with their particular choice. But for this to go forward, we all had to sign saying we would not challenge this, because what would be the point of proceeding if someone within the family was going to say, "No, I'm really against this. This shouldn't happen." And it wouldn't have been our right to do so. And we all recognized that. So we all, yeah, okay, I wouldn't do it, maybe. I agreed in my particular case, but others didn't. But they said, "Of course, you must have the right to choose. It's your life. You need to choose that." And then off she went. And that whole process, again, not a something for this particular discussion, but that whole process was such a lovely release, I suppose, of someone that's so very special in your life, that it was a really moving experience. And in terms of all the things that she taught us over our lifetime, she taught us even more as she died. It was such, I would like to have what she had, and that's why I hope that Canadians can have what she had.
Thank you, Price, for that introduction to your mom. She sounds like she was such a special lady and raised just an incredible family who supported her until the very end. Um, so you touched on this a little bit. Your mom did decide to go to Switzerland. MAID was not an option in Canada. It was her story and her case that really led us to have this option. And you allude to it, not being perfect yet. There's certainly a lot of room for when it comes to access and eligibility for MAID, but we do have it as an option, and thousands of people have accessed it. So that is one step. But I just want to take a step back and reflect a little bit more on the Switzerland experience. Can you reflect on what that was like for you? You mentioned that, some of your family didn't, they supported her, but maybe wouldn't have made the same decision. Can you talk a little bit about what all went into that?
And each person's family's experience, of course, will be different. But ours, when she made the decision and she told all of us that that's what she and your grandchildren, it's interesting because this sort of discussion, it's almost like talking about religion or politics. I don't talk about that, or I do talk about that, or whoever they might be. And so there were some people who were uncomfortable. In my particular case, my spouse at the time didn't want my children to know. And so I respected that. And so, but they really missed out on an opportunity to say goodbye to their grandmother in the way that we all did. And so when she said to everyone, this is my choice, this is what I want to do. We had a grieving process that was stretched out over 3 months. And I remember having a conversation with her. I was sort of gently crying on the phone saying, I'm going to so miss these conversations. And she said, yeah, I get that. But I had a chance to talk to her about that, to her sort of come back to me on that. So it was really great because people got to come and talk to her and express things. I try to live this way all the time. Like, I don't know if I'm going to be here tomorrow. So say today what you want to say. And we all learned that and did that. So as people sort of gathered around, she was in North Vancouver at that particular time. When at that particular juncture, it was illegal to have an assisted death in Canada. And so it all had to be kept on the QT, and no one could speak about this, even to their caregivers, people who had cared for her for a couple of years, who were special to her. She couldn't tell them. She had to leave. I'm going on a trip. Well, that trip was interesting. It was again, Lee helped her leave Vancouver, and she went to Toronto to visit her sister Val. And we all met in a hotel right at the airport, and we sat around. And if there's one, I guess, word about this whole process, it was almost joy, because we were all experiencing her sister, sitting on a bed, arm in arm, talking about things that had happened in the past. And we all got a chance to express that. And it was like a grief in the moment. And then, as it happened, I had been to Zurich about 2 days before. I had to fly back, and Mum and Lee and my sister Marie and Hollis, they flew on to Zurich, and then I flew right back and joined them. And in that process, in terms of for those, and I think the Canadian case is also the same, but there were so many times and so many hurdles, I suppose, I mean this in a positive way, that Mum had to speak to doctors, see doctors, ask questions, and we'd be asked to leave. Mum, we're going to talk to Mum now about her choice, and you can all just leave, which is right, because you don't want someone staring down the person and sort of, what you're supposed to say, because it's never like that. So many times, Kay, is this something you want to do? And she would say the same thing. I, Kay Carter, wish to die with dignity. And so eventually, on the day of itself, it was just such a lovely day. We watched CNN in the morning, we had breakfast, we got a special cab, two, because one required a wheelchair, and drove out to this beautiful facility out in the meadow in Switzerland. This special Dignitas has a particular house. And there were two caregivers there, and they explained the process about what was going to happen and what didn't have to happen. We could get back in those cabs and drive back to the hotel if that's what Mum wanted. And she says, nope, I'm ready, let's go. And so forms were filled and processes filled out. And Elsa said to her, well, okay, we're all done, we're all sit here. And so we can sit and reminisce, or we can go back to the hotel, nothing at all. She says, nope, I'm ready, let's go. Just like that. And so we knew that of the two drugs she would take, one was quite bitter. So I'd gone to a place I'd been to before, and I bought some Springly chocolates, and we all had little chocolates together. So when Mom had her first drink, that we would all have a chocolate at the same time, and we did. And then we all sat on this bed, and then this woman, it was just, I will probably be in tears when I say it, but she kneeled down and she put her hands on Mom's knees, and she said, look there, and she says, Kate, if you drink this drink, you will die. Is this what you want to do? And again, she said the same thing. I, Kate Carter, wish to die with dignity. Yes, yes. And Elsa said, she smiled and she says, I'll see you on the other side when I come. And so she drank the drink, and as its effects became more and more, we were all beside her. She lay back, and Elsa used to be an intensive care nurse, so she could probably still hear you. So talk to her. So we said how much we loved her and how great she was in our lives, until eventually, of course, her husband caregiver touched her and says, she's gone. And I could not have scripted this any better. She opened the door to the meadow, and the curtains billowed out, and she says, there, her spirit is free. It was just amazing. And so there's Mom, and she's lying in the bed, and this just speaks to the idea about death and how it can be different. She's dead. She's on the bed with a sheet over, and would anyone like a cognac? And yeah, we were really concerned about my sister Marie. We thought she had a special, close relationship with my mom. We thought for sure that she would be very distraught, and we were all sort of just thinking to ourselves, this process we've gone through has brought us to this place with no pain. It's been stretched out over such a long time. And this is what she wanted. She is lying there in a state that she wished for. We helped her get there, but we were happy that she was where she wanted to be. And it was interesting. And I remember that when we left in a taxi cab, I left something behind. And there's Mom sort of quietly on the bed. She's no longer with us. I remember just touching her on the head and said, goodbye, Mom. Easy, no drama. And then we went off to a bar that I had found, and we listened to some Swiss music and toasted Mom, and then and we flew home. And just as a corollary to that, on the way home, it turned out that the caregiver was on a particular flight, and she was going to help a fellow from Canada make his way to Switzerland for his MAID appointment. And so I went with her to this fellow, just in case he had any apprehension about this process at all. And just to explain to him what my experience had been. He didn't need any help. He was like, Mom, let's go. We're set. We're all set about that. So that was my experience. As I say, were I directing this as a movie, I'd say, don't change a thing. Don't script a thing differently. It was great.
Thank you, Price. I think, hearing what those moments were like in Switzerland for your mom and your family, it's just, I think few people, unless they've been there, would know, right? And I think it's so important that you've been able to share that with us today.
I agree.
So your mom had the death that she wanted. I mean, she did have to travel all the way to Switzerland for that, which is not an easy process at all. So fast forward a bit, can we talk a bit about the court case and what it was like to experience that case moving through the different court systems and all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada?
And again, yes, it was Lee that was approached by the BCCLA as a possible candidate, I suppose, to bring the case forward. And this, I think, would have been the first time since Sue Rodriguez and another stab at it. They had Joe Arve, who was going to be the lead counsel. And this was sort of, Lee had put it, this was sort of, for him, she had said that this is sort of a signature case for him. He's had many, many cases, but this was also an important one for him. He had disabilities himself and lived a full life, this wasn't something he wasn't optioning, but he believed that he should champion. And so when the BCCLA approached Lee, she talked with Hollis and said, we have, I guess, the bandwidth, the expression we might use today, to do this. And they explained, I guess, what the process would be, how long it would take, and we would not win, and then we would lose, and we would not win, and we'd lose, and then we would eventually be at the Supreme Court of Canada, and that's where this will probably land. And for the family, what Lee would do is she would just give us updates. You know, we've won here, we've lost here, we're moving to here. And where we became more involved, I suppose, in the process was when it went to the Supreme Court, because at that point it was gathered. Before that, it was a case of someone wanting an assisted death in Canada. And when it went to the Supreme Court, we're getting pretty close to the possibility it could happen. So the media was taking an interest. And in Lee's particular case, she is a great advocate, but she does not enjoy this. I don't mind. And I talk in front of hundreds of people all the time, so there's no big deal for me. So I would help her and when she needed it. What the Supreme Court, that process was really interesting because I'd never been to the Supreme Court before in my case, and I went and listened as they explained how each counsel would have an opportunity to speak and to listen to the justices ask questions of the government lawyers was so interesting because you could tell they'd ask these pointed questions. You tell me, sir, that Canada has a great sense of compassion for people with end-of-life choices to make because you decriminalized suicide. But now you're telling me that you're criminalizing the right for people to make that choice on their own. Explain that to me. Help me understand that. And the government of Canada stands. Rarely do you see lawyers doing this. And it was the Chief Justice was beautiful because in terms of irony, she was the dissenting voice in the Rodriguez case, and now she's the Chief Justice, and she adjudicates the particular process. Each are an equal justice, but they asked such pointed questions that the government of Canada lawyers really couldn't answer. It wasn't their fault. They're put in almost an untenable position because the right for people to choose is sort of inalienable. It's sort of common sense. And so they're having to argue against common sense, and they weren't that effective. Other groups came forward. It was interesting. People with particular, who thought they had a particular interest in this particular, advocates for people with disabilities, we shouldn't, and doctors also were there. The church was there. Each spoke, but ultimately it was just about them having their say. And sort of really, it was about the lawyers and their discussion. What was really interesting, and I don't think I'll ever experience this again, in 2016 when we came for the verdict was to be read, we got it 30 minutes before the press did. And there was a lot of hype around this because this was really a big thing. And when they went out to get the verdict, when they came back in the room, I'll never see it again, all of them had tears streaming down their eyes, down their face. They said, we won. We won everything. And as a lawyer, they had to ask a very pointed question, because if you ask too broad a question, you'll lose on some front you hadn't considered. So they asked a very pointed question about whether mom's rights had been violated because she couldn't get an assisted death in Canada. But the response in the Supreme Court was way broader. It was a blunderbuss in terms of scope. And it spoke to minors. It spoke to the people with disabilities, people who would be unable to make that decision down the road. The scope was amazing, and they couldn't have asked for this, but they gave them that. Not only was it unanimous by the court decision, but it was broad in its breadth. And so when this came down, we're down in the foyer of the Supreme Court of Canada, and Lee was being interviewed, and other parties were there saying how terrible this was and how great this was. Well, it was Lee saying how great it was, and us saying, isn't this a great day for Canadians? Other parties saying this is a terrible day for Canadians. The other part of the story you just touched on at the very beginning, that the sort of saddest part was, the reason the Supreme Court of Canada had to deal with this was because the government had not made legislation, canvassed Canadians and asked them what they thought. And I don't know, it was 80 or 85% of Canadians felt that we had the right to choose our own end. And in spite of that, they kept coming up with euphemisms for, balanced approach is a favorite one. But we don't balanced approach this process, which means we do nothing. So when the Minister of Justice called us or asked if we would come to Ottawa before they tabled legislation that would be in response to the Supreme Court of Canada's ruling, we went to talk to her. And when we did, it was really deflating. because when they use words like, well, we've tried to find a balance between this and this and this. Now, the Supreme Court of Canada has ruled that all Canadians have a broad spectrum of rights when it comes to their right to choose their end of life choices. And the government had whittled this down to the narrowest possible thing, 6 months to live, certified by certain doctors, and many restrictions. All the other protections, or I guess rights, that the Supreme Court of Canada had given Canadians were ignored. We'll deal with that later. So when they tabled this legislation, I think they mentioned that we, in discussion with the Carter family, well, it was discussion in as much as this is what we're going to do. It was not that we should have any influence on legislation, but there was, I don't know what we were even there for. And so putting a rubber stamp on their choice, but that was very sort of defeating, I suppose. I remember I spoke on TV and said that Canadians, I said, be very, very afraid, because your rights have been removed by the government of Canada that were given to you by the Supreme Court of Canada. And over time, we're slowly clawing back, use a tax euphemism, clawing back those rights. And they're speaking to these things a bit at a time. And I suppose part of it is you're learning to, as a nation, to deal with death in a more healthy and adult fashion, not to hide in a corner about it and oh, grandpa's dead. Oh, how did that happen? Well, we're all going, and won't it be better if we can each choose maybe a protracted care, and if a care facility is a good way to go? Well, that's great. And for some it isn't, and for them, this choice, I certainly understand. My mother's mother, she was in a hospital, and I remember her telling me how she was unable to move, and her mother was like my mother. My grandmother was a very sharp woman, and almost sad in a way, because she knew how dire his situation was. And they would discuss, what could mom do? What could Kay Carter do to help her mother die? And they couldn't come up with a way to help her die that wouldn't put her in jail. And ironic, it's my mother going through that same process and not telling, we all, disavowed of sort of knowing her plans, because the RCMP might knock on her door because of the laws in Canada at the time. But eventually we're getting those rights back. But I think as a country, we're coming to terms with that. And I think maybe the government of the day is saying, yeah, well, okay, we're a little more comfortable with the fact that 85% of Canadians really want this. I mean, how much more of a mandate do you need? In any event, we're getting there, and other speakers will speak to that later on.
Thank you, Price. I think it's a great time to welcome Ellen Wiebe now to address some of those pieces that you mentioned. But thank you, Price. That was incredible to hear more about your mom's story and everything that your family went through to really bring us to where we are today. So as mentioned, we have Dr. Ellen Wiebe with us. Ellen was the first clinician outside of Quebec to provide MAID. And we'll take a bit of a step back to understand, Ellen, why did you decide that MAID was something that you wanted to be involved in? How did you come to that decision?
I wasn't part of the movement or anything beforehand, but when the when the Carter case happened, I was delighted and very pleased. And it wasn't until September of that year, 2015, that I was having a conversation with a colleague who's a palliative care doctor. And I said, oh, our law is going to change in a few months. Are palliative care doctors like you going to be providing? And she said, oh, no, our national organization says that palliative care has absolutely nothing to do with hastening death. And therefore, that they would definitely not be involved. And I said, well, then somebody's going to need to provide these deaths come February. And she said, oh yeah. And so I talked to a friend of mine who was also an abortion provider, and said, I think we need to do something. And she was right on it, right? She's my age. And she said, absolutely. So we brainstormed and we contacted an Oregon doctor who was experienced, and we contacted people in the Netherlands. And then we went to the Netherlands in January of 2016 to talk directly with providers there and learn more and be trained, because we wanted to do it right. And the other thing was that I went to the College of Physicians and Surgeons of BC, because they're the ones who license, and said, listen, the law changes February 6th, and we're providing, but we need guidelines. And they said, I guess you do. And they got them. And so that was what we did. And, you know, our background, this is Rowie, Mallison, and I, our background as abortion providers for many years, decades, was all about rights and the right to choose. And we both felt, and again, getting older, you are more aware of mortality, that we were so aware that the right to choose your end was so incredibly important, and that we were getting this right as Canadians on February 6th, 2016, and nobody can, just like abortions, you know, the law is there, but you can't exercise your right unless you have a provider. And so that's why we did it, to get ready. And then what happened was, because we had talked to various people, including Dying with Dignity Canada and the people in the Netherlands, we were referred patients before the law changed. And so we met with the first patient, Hannah Schaefer, before February. And it was amazing to meet her. And Kelsey, you were just showing the picture of the book about her, and why I can say her name is because she agreed, not during the court case and so on. That was too hard. She didn't want all the publicity personal at that point in time. But she did want the story told afterwards. So her friend, Mary Valentich, wrote the book about the experience that Hannah had. So Hannah was a professor in the University of Calgary, and she had ALS, motor neuron disease. And she had been, you know, a vibrant, active person, and of course, so articulate. And but I didn't get to meet her like that. I got to meet her when she could no longer speak, and she could hardly move. She had movement in her facial muscles. She couldn't talk, but she could express herself with her face, and she had movement in part of one hand. And so although I saw her on video, she would communicate with me mostly by typing, because she had a little bit of movement. It would take her a very long time to write anything. So it was, you know, I'd ask her a question on email, and I might have to wait a couple of days for the answer. But we got to know each other a little bit, and her husband and her friend Mary were with her at each step of this. And so it was lovely to meet her and to realize her story. If you read the book, you'll understand it, was to follow Kay Carter. She wanted to go to Switzerland, and it was Mary who was doing all the arrangements to go to Dignitas, the same place that Kay Carter went. But her husband begged her to stay longer. And so she agreed to go a little further down the route. But the problem was that she was getting so weak that the trip to Switzerland might have been impossible. And so it was, you know, really touch and go when her husband could finally let her go. Or she could, you know, and he totally agreed that it was her right. He just couldn't say goodbye. And she respected that. So so when the time came, she was living in Calgary, which is why we were doing only video at the time. That was not long before COVID. And so they had to fly to Vancouver. And then we had all these problems to deal with. First of all, where were we going to do it? And I actually asked my husband, do you think I can bring her to our house? And he said, no. So he said, well, how about the airport hotel? Then she doesn't have to move very far. And we tried that. No. So I said, well, my office is an abortion clinic. It's a perfect place. We've got lounge chairs, we've got waiting rooms, we've got all this space. It just has to be, out of office hours. And so we figured that one out. Then it was, okay, we don't have the barbiturates that they use in Europe available in Canada. What drugs are we going to use? How am I going to get them? And so I talked to our pharmacist, and we, talked about various things. And he called his college, the College of Pharmacists, and they said, oh, no, you can't do that. You can't knowingly dispense a lethal drug. Oh, all right. How are we going to do this? So Rowie and I worked hard figuring out what was not the lethal dose, but the guaranteed lethal dose of a opioid. And we used an opioid because she wasn't taking any. Now, it's a very bad drug to be using for MAID normally, because most of our patients are on opioids, and therefore their body's resistant, and they can't die with it very easily. So we had to, figure out what was the dose that was actually going to work. And then I asked for a nurse to help me with the IV, and we checked, and their college wouldn't allow them to be anywhere near. So we had the law, but it covered doctors and not nurses and pharmacists. So I went to the surgical abortion clinic I was working at the time and trained to put IVs in, because it had been so many years since I'd had to put in IVs. So we had then, all this planned, and emails flying back and forth, and, oh, you're going to need a funeral home to pick up the body. So the family was working on that, and funeral home after funeral home refused. They would have nothing to do with it. They'd call the police on us. Oh dear. We found a funeral home who agreed that it was actually legal in February of 2016, and that they would help us. And so that was a crazy time. Just those were my vantage point. For her, it was getting through the court case. So in order to get MAID between February 6th and July of that year, you had to have a judge approve the application. And so she had to find a lawyer who would take the case. That is not easy. Then they had to find a judge that would hear it in time, because it had to be considered urgent. Otherwise, it would have been put off way too long for her. She wouldn't have even been able to travel to Vancouver. And so that was quite the issue, getting through that. And then it was this crazy last minute, she wanted it now. And when I met them, it was such a delight to meet Mary and Hannah and Daniel in person. And just like our videos, Hannah could still express herself with a thumbs up or a thumbs down. She could only move her thumb at that point. and expressions on her face. And she was so clear that she wanted, yes, she was ready to die. Yes, she wanted the medication. Yes, she knew it was going to, she was going to die from the medication. And it was the two doctors, Rowie Nelson and me, who were with her. And she just fell asleep. Opioids take longer than what the drugs we use now, so we had to wait, and the waiting was hard on her husband. You know, it was like, okay, she's gone. That's not Hannah anymore. But so he went into the other room, and Mary sat with her until I finally pronounced her death. And things have changed so much since then. I'm sorry, Kelsey, I know you've got questions for me.
That's okay. No, I appreciate you sharing everything with us about the story and just how you prepared so much to make sure you could support her and her family during this, and the many other patients, you know, since then. You know, after your experience that very first time, what did that mean to you as you reflected back on it, and you being the first person outside of Quebec, and you being able to support someone who had went through so much and, you know, jumped through so many hoops with the courts and coming out to Vancouver to see you, and, you know, just so much uncertainty at that time. What did it mean to you as a clinician and just as a person?
Two things. One, I was so grateful that I could give her what she wanted. I was so grateful. It was just amazing. And secondly, there were so many things to do, because we had to fix the problem with the nurses. We had to fix the problem with the pharmacists. We had to fix the problem with places that you can die. We had to fix the problem with the funeral homes who refused to pick up bodies. There were so many things wrong. And we had to fix the problem that the whole province of Alberta didn't have anybody who would take care of her in February. And we had to fix the problem that there weren't hardly anybody across the whole country who would do it. And even though it was legal. And so I realized that, you know, I had a lot to do. And I started on that mission. I was very delighted with the press. They were so helpful. I would call up my favorite journalists and say, oh, this is what happened. People have to know about this. We've got to change this. And they'd be on it. And so it was really, really a good relationship that we had with the press, and I was so grateful. And with Dying with Dignity, they were so much support, because although I also, like Price, I'm used to talking in front of lots of people, and have been in media a fair bit, I needed help. And Dying with Dignity Canada gave it to me, gave me help with, you know, figuring out which reporters were good to talk to if I didn't know them myself already. And being able to really support me through the best messages to get across, and they were helpful, very helpful. And you know, since Hannah, I have provided for another 420 people myself, and done assessments for other provisions, and taught and mentored people who went on to provide assisted dying, and again and again and again had that feeling like, oh, I can help somebody get the good death that they want, which is such a privilege, such an amazing privilege. And before COVID, there were so many hugs. Now we have to, you know, keep our distance. And I hate being, you know, masked for all the events, the assessments. And one of the reasons I do lots of video assessments is that I can see faces and I can have a face, which matters when you're trying to communicate with people, is being able to use your face. So delighted with that. So yes, and those things have changed drastically. Now, in my community, we've got MAID coordinating offices who bring us our patients. They don't have to call somebody up in Switzerland to get referred to somebody in Canada. And we have lots of support and help, but we have nurses who are, fabulous at getting their IVs in, so much better than me. And we've got some special places, not enough places. I work in all of the health authorities in BC, but primarily 2 of them. And one has a place in a care home that we are allowed to transfer patients to from places within that. But this health authority is huge. And so people have maybe a 2-hour drive to this place, and it's not good enough. We still have problems with funeral homes, not that they absolutely refuse to pick up a body, but that they will refuse to pre-book their pickups, which is really important in some situations. Like, for example, when we're doing it at my office, I need the funeral home there on time. And the other aspects, of course, now are related to the new laws from last year. And I know Kim will be talking about some of that. But now that we have what we call the track 2 patients, the ones whose natural death is not reasonably foreseeable, we have a lot more providers willing to help people whose natural deaths are reasonably foreseeable than those of us who are willing to see the ones whose are not. So we're into access problems again. And I get referrals from all over the place. So we still have more to do, Kelsey.
We do. So Ellen, it's been 6 years since your first provision of MAID and the first person you supported. Why do you continue providing MAID?
It is the best work I have ever done. And I've done great work. I delivered over 1,000 babies and I've done lots of great stuff. But being able to talk to people at the end of life and say, what is your choice? And here's what we can do, and watch that relief on their faces when they find out they're approved and can choose, and to be able to watch them pass peacefully with their families around them is just amazing. And I'm so grateful that I can be a part of it. So grateful to be Canadian for lots of reasons, but particularly for this one.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Ellen. So we have Kim joining us. And as mentioned in the introduction, Kim is a good friend of Audrey Parker, who many of us know from the advocacy she did at the end of her life. Really in the final weeks in her life, she decided that this was something she was going to talk about to the media and to politicians and really try to change. So Kim, why was advocating for change so important to Audrey?
Well, lots of reasons, and I'm going to fast track our little quick stuff here about Audrey and get to the point of her advocacy. But just very quickly, Audrey was an image consultant. She was a makeup artist by profession, but I would say she was a connector by heart. And anybody who sat in her makeup chair, while they might have been worried about what was happening on the outside, Audrey always made incredible connections to what was happening on the inside. And she was always really interested in what made people tick and what was important to them. I had the incredible opportunity to spend literally almost every day with Audrey in her last 3 years of life. In 2016, she was diagnosed with stage 4 breast cancer, which had already metastasized through her entire body. So really at the time of diagnosis, she knew that her life and her time was limited. I so remember the day I went to most of her appointments, and there were so many different doctors, but we were seeing her oncologist on this particular day. And Audrey was always a very straight up person. And I think even before her diagnosis, she thought differently about death, and it wasn't something that she really ever feared. So I would watch her with the doctors, and she would just always say, no sugarcoating, please. Like, I'm good. You can be straight up with me. Tell me exactly what's going on in this pod of mine. And so we had the conversation that probably within the year, it was 2018, it was early in 2018, very likely that she wouldn't have more than a year, 6 months, maybe 9 months to live. And so she talked to him about that. And this amazing point in our appointment where he said, do you know about MAID? And we both kind of sat up and said, no, we don't know anything about it. And so he was our first point of contact to tell us about the program. And honestly, and I've said this so many times, it was like you told Audrey, you've won a cruise around the world. Like it gave her such a sense of comfort, a sense of peace. And for anyone, who's watching here today who has a friend or family member, or maybe personally yourself, or going through, a life-altering illness or sickness, and if pain is a part of it, having control over as much as possible. You've just been given a diagnosis and you sort of feel the loss of control. And for Audrey, that gave her control back, and it was so important to her. So it's interesting, Kelsey, how you've kind of stacked the speakers, and it's a beautiful progression, because we learned and we heard from Price about his mom's beautiful death, but it had to happen outside Canada. And for Ellen to talk about her patient who was able to have, her chosen death inside Canada, but with a lot of challenges. Audrey's is very different, but of course we're going to learn it wasn't perfect. But the process with MAID was great. We felt very supported. She was assessed and approved by her 2 doctors, and she was feeling really good and confident. She had a CAT scan one day, which showed that now the cancer was starting to move to the lining of her brain. So what was the challenge with that? Of course, late stage consent. And all the joy that was given to her by being assessed and approved by MAID was now, it was like the carpet was ripped out from underneath her, and it was devastating to her. And so at this point, Audrey was starting to do some speaking. She was always in the media. She was somebody that always was talking about, a better end of life. And that was just, being somebody who had cancer. But the media started to pick it up, and that was the connection to Dying with Dignity, to say, okay, wait a minute here. We've actually figured out that you are in a separate category. You are already assessed and approved. Your death is imminent. And, this is something we want to really try and fight for. So that's where her advocacy kind of began.
Thank you so much for sharing more about who she was, and a bit about her story, and why Audrey wanted to raise awareness about this. And like you said, we certainly came a long way with the law, but there was this issue, and again, it was
the law.
Yeah, it was probably not very many people knew about that, unless, like Audrey, they were actually going through it and saying, wait a minute, this is going to be a big problem for me. So Audrey wrote her own obituary before she died, and it sounds like that really ties into who she was as someone saying to the doctors, just tell me what's going on, don't sugarcoat this, and wanting to, raise awareness about death and dying. And she shared in that obituary that there's so much negativity and fear around death, but I always believed our first breath gives us life, but it's our final breath that honors our lifetime. Can you reflect on that statement and maybe let us know what it meant for Audrey in the final weeks of her life?
Right. So Audrey spent the last 4 weeks of her life working closely with Dying with Dignity, and it really gave her purpose. This is 5 of us. This was Audrey. This was her bed in her room, which she had to spend a lot of time in due to incredible pain. So we ended up dubbing it the bed of truth, because we all kinds of conversations were held there, and it was an incredible time. But Audrey's take on life was really, really important, and she used that feeling to become an advocate. And of course, in those last weeks and then days, there were some pleas and some political pressure put forward to see if there was an opportunity that Audrey's case could be changed. But in the end, she knew that her cancer was advancing, and it was more important for her to have control over her end of life, to have that beautiful death. She chose November 1st, 2018. And the girlfriends that you're seeing there right now will never forget, it was one thing to talk about it. It was imminent, it was coming. But when she actually had to say, unfortunately, I now have to end my life sooner than I would wish in order to experience, my beautiful end of life experience. And that was the real challenge. So, I'll just speak quickly, because I know perhaps a little bit short on time, but, Audrey did have the beautiful death. We had a nurse practitioner that came to her home. We were surrounded by her, really almost similar to the picture that you're seeing there, with her mom as well. And it was beautiful. And I can tell you, like, just listening to Price talk about his mom and her courage and bravery, it really brought me back to Audrey's last moments, where with a beautiful singer-songwriter playing softly in the room, singing one of her favorite songs, putting her hand on her chest and seeing the complete sense of peace. And she laid down and said, let's start. Let's get this show on the road. So Audrey asked me to continue her fight. This really gave her purpose, and it's been a really honor to work with Dying with Dignity. And I've learned a lot about the law, and we were very, very excited. Amazing that Bill C7 was brought forward, and that Audrey was able to help protect other Canadians who also were assessed and approved, who would no longer have to do, a second late stage consent. Meant the world to us.
Thanks so much. And just to reflect on that a little bit more, it was March of last year where we got the news that the waiver of final consent would be an option for people. What happened to you when you found out? What did you do when you knew that Audrey's amendment would finally come into place? How did you react when you heard that news?
Yeah, well, it was, I will say, it was an exciting day. The build was so slow, and there were so many conversations and media interviews and many other people continuing to advocate. But I know that Audrey would, she would have been so happy to have that news and know that nobody else would have to, what she talked about, play a cruel game of chicken with their life. Like, we will never know how long Audrey would have had. We talked a lot about her wanting to make it to that Christmas. It was her favorite time of year. We just don't know. And so you feel so happy for other people, other Canadians and their families. And to any of you who are on the call today, who may be experiencing these things, I just think, Audrey worked really hard. And, when she realized, okay, my advocacy is not going to help me, but if it's going to help others, then that is going to be how, that will be my legacy, and she'd be pretty proud of it.
Thanks so much, Kim. And I think it's always so nice to just reflect on how far we've come as a country, and all the people who made it happen. And, Audrey is certainly one of them. And she during those last weeks, deciding that this is what I'm going to do and this is how I'm going to spend my time, like you said, knowing that it probably wasn't going to change things for her situation, but trying to change things for people in the future. I think that's just so, special and powerful. And we certainly appreciate hearing more about who she was and what her impact continues to be for Canadians. What I'd like to do now is welcome back all of our speakers today. If you want to turn on your webcams, and we will take a few questions from the audience today. So a question for Price. You mentioned how during the lead up to your mother's death and going to Switzerland, there was a lot of conversations. There was a lot happening. You knew this was going to happen, that she was going to make the trip on that date, and what was going to happen once you got there. How did that impact your grief after you returned to Canada and after your mother's death? Do you think it had an impact on how you processed everything?
Oh, I would wish this for anyone. As so glaringly obvious, we're all going to die. That you can have this. It brings it to the fore. You've got to talk about it because it's going to happen, and you have a date. All these people can express that it's unusual, and you can say on this time, at this day, on this time, I will be dying. But it really brings your feet to the fire in terms of conversation and what you want to say. So when we came back, as I mentioned, right when Mom has just died, and we're having a cognac and we're sort of toasting her life, and we're laughing, we're joking, it's when her spirit went out with all those curtains out the window, and she was free, we were free too. And so we had a long time to grieve. And my father died in a hot tub in Japan on a vacation. And there was no grieving, there's no preemptive time to say, hey, Dad, I want to tell you some few things. We should always do that, as I mentioned earlier. But they were polar opposites for death. And while he didn't try to teach us through his death, he did, because his partner, my mother, died in such a different way that we had such a long time to say goodbye. And, like any family, there's dynamics that go on, and there's people who might have unresolved things they want to talk about, and those things could be discussed. It was almost like restorative justice for everybody. And I didn't like how I never got to have extra portions of dessert or whatever it might have been, whatever grievance you might have had, and you could talk about it and you could resolve it and you would come to peace with that. So when we came home, what was interesting was, a little aside, I mentioned that my former spouse didn't want my children to know. And so respected that. When Mom came through Toronto, I was living in Guelph at the time. They didn't join us at the hotel in Toronto. But when I came back from Switzerland and I sat down with them and I said, I have to tell you that Grandma has died. And they had two grandmas. One was in the prairies, one was in the mountains, and Kay was Mountain Grandma. And Mountain Grandma has died. Well, when the wake, which happened afterwards in Vancouver a week or two later, was going to happen, and we were going to go out to it, it was going to be more than obvious that the only three people in the room that wouldn't know that Mom has had an assisted death would be my children. So I talked with my spouse and said, they're going to have to know. They have to know. It's because they're the only ones that don't, and we can't ask everyone to be quiet about it. We're celebrating this. And what was so beautiful about that was about how well my son, as an example of the three of them. So I said, I need to tell you about Mom's death, and I need to tell you that it was more than I had actually initially said. So I explained exactly what I've said to you and how it happened for us in a little more detail. And I said, do you have any questions or anything you wanted to ask me or say? And my son just goes, wow, that is so Grandma, that she should do that. Which isn't it a great thing to do that he got it, that she gave it, that she gave to her grandchildren, she gave to all of us about this. It's okay. It's really okay. And as Ellen has said, this is their wish. Isn't it great we can give them their wish? But often when it comes to grief and for people dying, it's about not wanting to let go. We have the problem, they don't. And so when we had this wake, 100, I don't know how many people were there. It was a great celebration. It was, the wakes of old when she was such a great person, and let me tell you a story. And there was crying, I suppose, but everyone was happy for her because she'd gone the way she wanted to.
Thank you, Bryce. A question for you, Kim, about honoring Audrey's memory. I think many of us who are involved in this space think about Audrey all the time or mention Audrey all the time through Audrey's amendment. So she's at top of mind really when we're having discussions about this is now an option that you have because this woman decided to raise awareness about this flaw in the legislation. So, Price shared with us a bit about what happened after his mother's death and how her life was celebrated. If you're comfortable sharing with our audience, how your friend group celebrated Audrey and continued to reflect on her incredible life.
Yeah. So Audrey had quite what we call a celebration of life, and she took great joy in creating the menu. There was an after party, there was chocolate chip strawberries, and there was champagne, and there were, I think she had 18 honorary pallbearers, all women. Audrey she painted the picture and then she showed us what it looked like. And she said, death can be good. Your last breath is as important as your first breath. There was just so many lessons. And I have 4 children, 3 sons and 1 daughter, and every one of them has a different perspective on dying. And, as Price has said, there's so much comfort in all of this. It's just so profound how, we pass through life, avoiding this kind of end part. And Audrey said, let's get up close and personal about the end and let's make it a beautiful thing. And so it really changes perspective. And I know that I walk through this life differently every day, and I am so grateful to have known her, and it's just so nice to know that she's passed it. I love when people say such kind things about her, because she really wanted to help others, and one of her other favorite sayings was, be kind just because you can, for no other reason.
That's lovely. Thank you, Kim. So a question for you, Ellen. You talked about the early days of MAID and the conversation you had with your palliative care colleague saying, oh, is this going to be something that's just going to be part of your practice as a clinician? And the response was no. And you and Roe sort of stepped forward to be the firsts in this country. How have things changed over the years when it comes to clinician involvement with MAID? You also talked a bit about how there's more clinicians prepared to see people whose natural death is reasonably foreseeable versus those who aren't. Where are we at there with just the medical community and how things are playing out?
So it's mixed. We still have a lot of difficulty with psychiatrists and with palliative care doctors, but there's a lot more palliative care facilities and doctors who now believe that palliative care does include the full end-of-life care, so that if their patients choose medical assistance in dying, they refer to us and we come in. It's a very rare palliative care doctor who actually provides, but that they work with us now. So that has improved a lot. There's still major resistance, and the worst by far is the faith-based facilities. We still have a huge problem with them. Not only that they will not allow MAID on the premises, but that they, a lot of them insist that everybody have a psychiatric consult if they ask for MAID, and I'll get a consult and I'll go in to see somebody who look through the records and find out that they asked for MAID 3 weeks ago and nobody passed it on to anybody else. It was noted in the chart, but that's all. So, and these are people who shouldn't wait 3 weeks. I don't know what necessarily anybody should, but it was, there's still a lot of difficulties.
Well, as you mentioned, Ellen, we have lots of work to do. We're so grateful for the three of you and your families who have been able to get us to the point that we're at today. I think it's so important to be able to reflect back on how we ended up having MAID law in Canada, and just how impactful it has been over the past 6 years or so. But much more to come. And as always, please continue to check our website. We continue to update our supporters on where things are and what's changing and what we can expect in the coming months when it comes to different changes with the assisted dying law. So we will leave it there. I want to thank Price, Kim, and Ellen so much for everything this afternoon. It was so wonderful to hear your insights and your perspectives. And I'm so grateful for everything that you were able to share this afternoon. As mentioned, we'll be back on Thursday for another webinar on the history of attitudes towards death. So please register if you haven't already. And once we wrap things up, you're going to have a survey popping up on your screen. If you could take a minute to fill that out and let us know what you thought, that would be appreciated. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us, and have a great rest of your day. Take care.